Welcome back to the Command Post Radio Room. As always, I am your host, Brandon Rapp, and I thank you all for joining this continuation of the Warning from History series. In the inaugural episode of this series, we examine the Red Terror. We look directly into the eyes of a brand of tyranny that didn't devolve into cruelty by accident. We addressed why the machinery of slaughter under Vladimir Lenin was not a panicked improvisation born of the Russian Civil War. Rather that it was calculated, it was deliberate. The Cheka was forged within weeks of the Bolshevik seizure of power, establishing a terrifying apparatus where your social class, your education, or your father's trade became a death sentence. Remember the horrific words of Martin Latsis, laying bare the soul of the regime. Do not look for evidence of specific acts. Ask instead to which class the accused belongs. Murder was not a tragic byproduct of the revolution. Terror was the beating heart, the fundamental operating system of the Soviet Union's specific flavor of socialism. We ended that episode standing on the precipice of an even deeper abyss, looking toward the Great Terror under Stalin, which was the same soul-crushing system scaled up, industrialized, and perfected until an entire continent choked on suspicion and mass graves. In fact, I had intended this second episode to cover the Great Terror. But before we descend into that horror, if you recall the premise from the previous episode, the entire reason I shifted from the American Civil War and World Wars to communism was to confront the growing embrace in the West with Marxist ideology. This slight detour came about as I was perusing social media. I came across a short video by a young woman that caught my attention and that I wanted to tackle. The point here isn't to mock or ridicule the woman in the video, rather it is to highlight some common goalpost shifts in these debates about socialism. Common counter-arguments, when debating the merits of socialism, are, well, socialism hasn't really been tried. The Soviet Union, China, Cuba, etc., that's not true socialism. Or, their leaders screwed up what Karl Marx actually intended. You may have heard some of those before. In this particular video, her premise is basically that socialism and communism have never actually failed on their own demerits because they were never given a fair shake. Communist governments are always sabotaged from the outset by the West in general, and the United States in particular. The United States intervenes, slapping on suffocating embargoes, orchestrating coups, launching covert invasions, and choking nascent socialist utopias in their infancy. The clip issues a challenge, and that challenge is to name a single major socialist or communist movement that the United States did not intervene against, whether through sanctions, isolation, invasion, the funding of opposition, embargoes, or coup attempts. She lists Cuba, Chile, Nicaragua, Vietnam, Korea, Guatemala, Grenada, Laos, Cambodia, and Angola, concluding that because American interference is always present, the experiment itself was never allowed to run. If that claim holds up under scrutiny, it redefines how we view 20th century history. But if it fails the test, if the internal state-owned production, the destruction of markets, and the suppression of individual initiative are what actually destroyed these societies, then shifting the blame entirely onto Western interference becomes a way to insulate an ideology from the historical record. Take a listen.
So we're going to talk about socialism and communism today. I feel like the main argument I hear against socialism and communism is, oh, it never works, oh, it sounds good, but it doesn't work. And honestly, I feel like people who argue against it make the mistake when they respond to that. They immediately start trying to prove socialism or communism worked somewhere. But I think that's the wrong conversation. I think the better question is, when was socialism or communism ever allowed to fail or succeed on its own? So now, riddle me this. Can you name a major socialist or communist movement the United States did not intervene in? Like, no sanctions, they didn't isolate them, they didn't destabilize them, they did not invade them, they didn't fund opposition against them, they didn't, support a coup or an embargo. No, probably not. Cuba, the embargo, invasion attempts, assassination attempts, covert operations. Chile, the 1973 coup. Nicaragua, the Contra War, and the CIA funding the crack epidemic. Yeah, it's a fun one. Vietnam, decades of war. Korea, the Korean War. Guatemala, the 1954 coup. Grenada, U.S. invasion. Laos, covert war. Cambodia, bombing campaigns. Angola, Cold War intervention. This is like just a few of them.
Before we get into specifics, there are three main problems that I count with how this argument is constructed. These are logical flaws that exist prior to any case study. First, the argument focuses exclusively on Western actions without touching on the massive direct interventions executed by communist states. That silence applies a double standard where Western policies are categorized as imperialist interference, while Soviet, Chinese, Cuban, or Vietnamese military invasions are simply chalked up as fraternal assistance or anti-imperialism and decolonization. Look at the actual record of communist intervention and military occupation. The Soviet Union did not simply leave Eastern Europe alone after 1945. It imposed and maintained satellite dictatorships by force across Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltic states. When those populations tried to breathe, when Hungary rose in 1956, or Prague sought reform in 1968, Soviet tanks rolled through their streets, crushing reform movements and sending leaders to execution squads or prisons. The Brezhnev Doctrine explicitly asserted Moscow's right to militarily invade any socialist state that strayed from the bloc. There's also the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which triggered a decade of devastation that cost hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives, with far-reaching consequences that impacted our century, the 21st. Soviet arms and advisors fueled proxy wars across Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Cuba deployed tens of thousands of combat troops to Angola and Ethiopia. Mao's China fought in Korea, invaded Vietnam in 1979, and swallowed Tibet and other provinces. Vietnam invaded and occupied Cambodia. If intervention prevents a system from being judged, then intellectual honesty requires placing these instances right beside the Western list. Second, the argument confuses correlation with causation. It takes economic crises that were already spiraling due to internal structural problems and blames their collapse entirely on foreign pressures that arrived later. Internal policy choices, such as forced collectivization, the destruction of private enterprise, price controls that left market shelves bare, and the replacing of economic signals with party dogma, were already driving production into the ground. The timeline matters. If the economic rot and supply collapse were already underway before external pressures intensified, foreign intervention cannot be labeled the inherent cause. And third, the argument has no stopping rule. It makes the theory completely unfalsifiable. If every economic failure, every breadline, every wall built to stop fleeing citizens, and every mass exodus can be reassigned to the category of American interference, then no amount of evidence could ever disprove the thesis. To test the video's premise, we need to look at the actual historical record, at cases where American hostility was minimal, or where the United States actually stepped in with massive material support to keep the socialist state alive, and then see whether the system still stagnated, starved, or collapsed. Finally, you can see how that unfalsifiability unfolds in her own challenge. She asks, can you name a major socialist or communist movement the United States didn't intervene against? All her examples are from the Cold War era, but the Cold War was a genuinely global, decades-long bipolar conflict. The United States maintained an adversarial posture, whether through sanctions, the funding of an opposition party, diplomatic isolation, covert operations, or direct military action, toward almost every self-declared socialist state during that era, just as the Soviet Union and Communist China put similar pressure on nations aligned with Washington and London. So asking the question, can you name one country, will basically never produce a clean counterexample. And that's not due to the premise being correct, but because the challenge is constructed so that satisfying it is nearly automatic. Reciting a list of countries doesn't accumulate historical evidence. It simply redemonstrates that the United States was an active participant in the Cold War, which nobody disputes. There is a much simpler and direct way to see this problem, and that is by looking at the core institutional package itself, which is the suppression of private property, the destruction of the free market, and the replacement of those with centralized political allocation. We see that exact same institutional package produce the exact same family of results, such as shortages, stagnation, repression, oftentimes through violence, and eventual collapse, across wildly different external environments. It happens whether there is massive Western material support, as in the early Soviet Union. It happens through near total isolation, as in Albania. It happens with minimal to no American involvement, as in Mao's China during the horror of the Great Leap Forward. And it happens where concurrent Western pressure also exists, as in Chile under Allende. When the same cause repeatedly yields the same destructive effect across a vast range of conditions, the burden of proof shifts entirely. Anyone who wants to claim that external American pressure was the decisive driver must also explain why the pattern suddenly stops working everywhere else. Simply pointing to the existence of pressure does not meet that burden. The far more economical explanation, the obvious explanation, is that the institutional design itself is the primary driver of failure. Let's step directly into the evidence, starting with the Soviet Union. History paints a different picture than the one in the clip. Consider the Russian Civil War. While true that the Allied forces landed small detachments in Arkhangelsk, Murmansk, and the Far East, that very limited presence wasn't around very long. For nearly 7 decades afterward, the Soviet Empire stood on its own. There was no eternal American blockade. In fact, the blockade came from the Soviet Union after the war, but we'll get into that a little later. Anyway, no American blockade of the Soviet Union. On the contrary, Western capital, machinery, and technical genius flowed continuously across Soviet borders to prop up a regime that could not invent or produce enough on its own. In one of history's greatest ironies, the Western world routinely handed over the fruits of free market innovation to a system whose entire ideology demanded the destruction of free markets. In 1991, the Soviet Union did not collapse under the tread of American tanks. It rotted from the inside out. It disintegrated because an economy stripped of private property and innovation eventually runs out of momentum. When central planners dictate the price of every loaf of bread, every boot, and every ton of steel, scarcity becomes the baseline of existence. The system died of internal exhaustion. When Mikhail Gorbachev tried to reform the Soviet Union through glasnost and perestroika, that is openness and restructuring, it was the straw that broke the camel's, or should I say bear's, back. Recall what we are arguing here. The core tenet of socialist theory is that centralizing control creates a rational, humane society, a utopia, a land of plenty. But when you look at the apparatus built under Lenin, the Cheka, the summary executions, the arbitrary classification of human beings as class enemies, you realize that political terror and economic collapse were never separate phenomena. They were twin arms of the exact same beast. When a state decides that an individual's life has no intrinsic value, it treats both human beings and human labor as disposable raw material. Socialism, by design, reduces its citizens to potential for the state, for the collective good, of course. By the summer of 1921, the nightmare of war communism had fully taken hold. The Bolsheviks had spent years raiding the countryside, tearing grain from the hands of peasants at gunpoint, banning private trade, and trying to run an economy through engineered terror. Then came the drought. The result was a famine across the Volga region that affected 25 to 35 million human souls. At the height of the crisis, 100,000 people were dying every single week. Think about that for a minute. That is a Burbank, California, or a Boca Raton, Florida, disappearing from the map every single week. Independent estimates put the total body count between 5 and 10 million souls. The imagery out of the Volga in 1921 is one of unimaginable suffering, brought on by the actions and policy choices of the world's first socialist state, independent of any Western intervention of any kind. Villages were filled with children whose bellies were swollen and eyes hollow, reduced to emaciated skeletons. Desperate mothers were selling human flesh in open markets to feed their families something, anything. Entire families would die quietly in dirt hovels while Soviet commissars searched their barns for hidden grain. In July 1921, writer Maxim Gorky sent a desperate plea out to the international community for help. Who answered? Well, the greatest free market system the world has ever seen, of course. Enter Herbert Hoover in the American Relief Administration. Hoover laid down strict conditions before shipping a single pound of food. The Bolsheviks had to release imprisoned Americans, and American workers had to be allowed to operate with complete freedom. The resulting Riga Agreement of August 1921 was an astonishing achievement. A capitalist power was granted near-sovereign authority inside a totalitarian state to prevent mass starvation. At its peak in the summer of 1922, the ARA was feeding between 10 and 11 million starving people every single day. A mere 200 to 300 American relief workers, in conjunction with roughly 120,000 local Russian workers, moved nearly 1 million tons of food, seed, clothing, and medical supplies across the plagued landscape. They vaccinated over 7 million people, stamped out typhus outbreaks, supplied 15,000 hospitals, and provided seed grain to plant 8 million acres of wheat. Total American expenditures exceeded $60 million, that's nearly $2 billion today, including $20 million directly appropriated by the U.S. Congress and millions more in private donations alongside Soviet gold contributions for additional aid. Historians estimate that American intervention saved between 5 and 10 million Russian lives. Gorky wrote directly to Hoover, declaring that this act of capitalist mercy would go down in history as an achievement that would be remembered by Russia for eternity. How wrong he was. Now let's pause for a moment and reflect on that. If the premise articulated in the clip, if the primary goal of the United States was to systematically crush socialist experiments at all costs, why did Washington organize the largest humanitarian rescue mission in human history at the time to keep millions of Soviet citizens alive? If the goal of the capitalist West was to sabotage socialist states through intervention, well, the best intervention would have been not intervening at all. The tragedy was not American intervention. The actual tragedy was that once the crisis passed and American corn and wheat filled Soviet bellies, the Soviet state erased the memory. Commissars who had toasted American generosity quickly branded those same relief workers as imperialist spies and saboteurs. The regime hid its own monstrous policy failures behind an iron curtain of historical amnesia. 20 years later, the pattern repeated on an astronomical scale. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Hitler's panzers blitzed into the Soviet Union, overrunning its industrial heartlands in the Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. The Soviet state was forced to take desperate and frantic measures. Entire industrial plants were stripped down to their foundations under German artillery fire, loaded onto rail cars, and hauled thousands of miles east into the cold wastes of the Urals and Siberia. Millions of families were displaced, and vital weapons production ground to a screeching halt, while new foundries were hastily erected in the permafrost. Make no mistake, the Soviet Union was on the verge of total annihilation. Here again, free market excess stepped in to stop the bleeding. Through the Lend-Lease Act, the United States poured roughly $11.3 billion into the Soviet war effort between 1941 and 1945, equivalent to roughly $250 billion today. Shipments braved frozen, U-boat-infested waters to Murmansk, cut through the Persian corridor, and traversed the hostile Japanese-controlled Pacific to Vladivostok, which was made possible due to the neutrality pact between Tokyo and Moscow. The Imperial Japanese Navy refrained from attacking the Soviet flag freighters that carried a huge share of the aid. Many of these Soviet flag freighters were American vessels that had transferred their registry so that they could pass unmolested. The sheer volume of material sent to sustain the Red Army is almost impossible to comprehend. 15,000 aircraft, 7,000 tanks, 400,000 trucks and jeeps, 2,000 locomotives, 11,000 freight cars, millions of tons of track, millions of tons of steel, copper, explosives, and high-octane aviation fuel made their way from privately owned American factories, sailed across God's vast oceans at great risk to the merchant marine crews transporting them, as well as their military escorts, in order to sustain the Red Army's effort to stop the Nazi jackboot from crushing them beneath its hobnailed heel. Speaking of boots, America also supplied over 15 million pairs of winter boots and 4.5 million tons of food to the Red Army. Without American trucks, the Red Army would have been bogged down in the Rasputitsa of Eastern Europe, unable to transport its artillery or mount rapid offensives. Without American canned meat, Soviet soldiers would have succumbed to starvation as well as Nazi firepower. The Soviet leadership knew it, too. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, Joseph Stalin stood up and openly acknowledged that without American machinery, the Allies would have lost the war. Nikita Khrushchev later wrote in his memoirs that without U.S. transport and supplies, Soviet losses would have been colossal and victory might have been impossible. It is reported that even Marshal Zhukov admitted in private that without American explosives, steel, and trucks, the Red Army simply could not have continued fighting, but that last point is debated. Personally, I believe he probably said it. That brings us back to the premise. Did America intervene to sabotage socialism? The historical record shows that American factories, farms, and logistics sustained the Soviet military through its most extreme existential crisis. The Soviet state survived a march on Berlin because American manufacturing supplied its logistics so that its relocated factories could focus on T-34s and anti-tank artillery. And yet, despite all that, 46 years after Hitler was defeated, that same Soviet state dissolved into the ash heap of history. Look at what happened immediately after that wartime alliance ended. Far from the West surrounding a peaceful worker state, in fact, Western Europe and the United States were the underdogs as far as military strength was concerned, the Soviet Union immediately turned its ideological weapons outward. In 1948, the city of Berlin sat deep inside the Soviet occupation zone, administered jointly by the Allied powers. Desperate to squeeze the Western Allies out and engulf the former heart of the German Empire, Soviet forces launched the Berlin blockade in June 1948. They severed every road, every railway line, and every canal leading into West Berlin. They cut off electricity from the Soviet zone, attempting to use starvation and bitter cold as a political cudgel. The Western response to the Berlin blockade was not a military assault, though it did involve the military. I'm talking about the Berlin airlift. For 15 months, American and British pilots flew over hostile air corridors around the clock, landing every 45 seconds to drop off coal, medicine, and food. These flights kept the city alive against a communist blockade designed to use hunger as a weapon. Are you noticing a pattern here, by the way? If not Western intervention, then what prompted such ruthless tactics? George Kennan answered that question from Moscow in his famous 1946 long telegram. Kennan recognized that Soviet hostility was not a reaction to Western aggression. It stemmed from an internal psychological need. The dictatorship required an external enemy to justify its own brutal tyranny. Marxist ideology provided the cover. You see, it taught that capitalism and socialism could never peacefully coexist. When you look at these examples, the myth of external American sabotage crumbles entirely. Let's continue with post-1945 Germany. One people, one language, one shared heritage, split in two. The Western half built a society grounded in private property, free markets, and individual liberty, while the Eastern half was subjected to Soviet planning and political control. Needless to say, the result was so predictable that by 1961, the East German regime had to build a wall complete with barbed wire, landmines, and guard towers armed with automatic rifles. This wasn't a wall to defend against American aggression. No, you see, this wall was built to stop desperate citizens from escaping the socialist paradise. People risked being torn apart by guard dogs or shot in the back just to reach freedom on the other side of the Brandenburg Gate. In fact, one of the most striking examples is that of Konrad Schumann, a 19-year-old East German border guard. On August 15, 1961, as Berlin was being cordoned off, he took a running leap across a barbed wire barrier into West Berlin, a prison guard escaping his own prison. A photograph of that moment was taken and became one of the most iconic photos of the Cold War. Now look at the Korean Peninsula. In the 1950s, the Communist North held the industrial core and enjoyed massive financial backing from Moscow and Beijing. By contrast, South Korea was an impoverished, war-torn agrarian state. Today, South Korea stands as a modern technological and economic power, while North Korea remains a dark, starving, militarized state where millions suffered famines in the 1990s while their dear leaders built conventional arms and nuclear weapons. You cannot blame American intervention for that chasm. South Korea flourished because its institutions created the conditions that allowed human creativity, ingenuity, and innovation to grow and thrive. This story repeats everywhere central planning takes root. In Mao's China, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution left tens of millions dead through engineered famines and ideological purges, without requiring a single American action to bring about that horror. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge emptied entire cities at gunpoint, abolished currency entirely, executed anyone who wore glasses or spoke a foreign language, and filled the killing fields with mountains of human skulls until another communist state, Vietnam, invaded and overthrew the government. In Albania, the Hadja regime sealed the nation off from the entire world, building hundreds of thousands of concrete bunkers while the people sank into poverty and despair. In Venezuela, expropriations and price controls wrecked an economy rich with oil, causing hyperinflation and lines for basic supplies such as food and toilet paper years before major American sanctions were ever applied. Throughout the history of socialist states, we repeatedly observed the same institutional patterns. So how do we address the laundry list of countries rattled off in that clip? Well, we answer it by looking at the facts. Granting that American foreign policy was often aggressive and interventionist during the Cold War does not prove that socialism works. All that it does is prove that the Cold War was a tense period in history between two competing ideologies. But to reduce it to nothing more than, well, America intervened in all these places, so that's not a fair test of whether communism actually works when left alone, well, that just serves to oversimplify and reduce a complex geopolitical and ideological struggle to platitudes. Take Cuba. The clip points to the American embargo as the sole explanation for 6 decades of Cuban economic stagnation and misery. But it conveniently leaves out that during the 1980s, the Soviet Union was pouring $4 to $6 billion of direct subsidies into Havana every single year. When the Soviet Union collapsed and that free money vanished overnight, the Cuban economy fell off a cliff, shrinking by 35% during a grim period of poverty that the regime called the Special Period. Yes, the American embargo was a factor in that, but the structural failures, the lack of basic property rights, the suppression of small business, the centralized control over every farm and factory is what keeps the Cuban people trapped in scarcity. And, like East Germany, those structural failures are what motivates mass immigration, at some points roughly 200,000 Cubans a year, to risk their lives attempting to cross the 90 miles of the Caribbean in rickety hand-constructed rafts to reach a better life here in the capitalist superpower. Look at Chile under Salvador Allende between 1970 and 1973. By that point, the United States had been watching a clear, unmistakable pattern of communist expansion across the globe. The Soviet Union had imposed satellite dictatorships across the Iron Curtain of Eastern Europe, initiated the Berlin blockade to starve the West out of the German capital, backed the North Korean invasion of South Korea, and sent tanks to squeeze popular uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia under their treads. In the Western Hemisphere, Cuba had gone from revolution in 1959 to a full Soviet-aligned communist state, housing Soviet military forces, while Cuban and Soviet support for revolutionary movements rippled across the region. Against that encroachment, Allende's election in 1970 registered in Washington as an immediate and serious concern. Allende's coalition included the Communist Party of Chile, and his government moved quickly to deepen political and military ties with both Havana and Moscow. Henry Kissinger and the Nixon administration responded by launching a targeted campaign of economic pressure by restricting international credit, limiting export-import bank financing, and actively working to cut Chile off from the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank loans. It is true that the American campaign began early and ran concurrently with Allende's domestic program, and was a direct application of the containment strategy that had guided American foreign policy since the late 1940s. Keep in mind, though, that the strategy was forged in direct response to decades of prior communist aggression and was not an arbitrary act directed specifically for Chile. Does that prove the argument being made in the video? No, it does not, because the premise of American intervention still ignores a critical distinction. American credit restrictions did not create Chile's runaway inflation, its empty shelves, or its total supply collapse. Those disasters were driven directly by Allende's own policy choices of sweeping nationalizations of industry and agriculture, massive fiscal deficits paid for by printing mountains of money, and rigid price controls that destroyed every incentive for domestic producers to bring food to the market. By 1972, the Chilean economy was already starving from the stagnation of its own policies. The concurrent American campaign to restrict foreign credit certainly made the self-inflicted crisis harder to manage, but it did not create the crisis. Long before the military coup in September of 1973, the structural failures of the socialist program were both glaring and devastating to daily life. Long lines formed outside barren grocery stores because central planning had crippled the supply chain. The intervention thesis tries to rewrite history by elevating external American pressures into the primary driver of failure, attempting to erase the economic self-destruction that was engineered from within. Look at Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas had to be propped up by massive military and economic backing from Moscow and Havana, while economic mismanagement and political repression devastated the country. On that subject, really quick, the clip's casual assertion that the CIA funded the domestic crack epidemic is a long-debunked conspiracy theory. Extensive, exhaustive investigations, including the CIA Inspector General's 1998 report, the Justice Department's 1997 review, and the Senate's own Kerry Committee, all reached the same conclusion. Now, just to be clear, there are a few cases in which the State Department had paid companies later shown to be linked to traffickers for humanitarian aid, and CIA reporting and handling of allegations about certain assets was deemed insufficient. Those are facts and proof of misconduct during the Contra War. However, these instances of misconduct do not equate to a CIA Black Book conspiracy to create or fund the crack epidemic. The same probes explicitly rejected the claim made by Gary Webb in his Dark Alliance series, published by the San Jose Mercury News, that the CIA funded the American crack epidemic. Moving on to Vietnam, Laos, Angola, and Grenada, though I won't spend too much time with these as I plan to address these specific cases more thoroughly in later episodes. These were strategic battlegrounds in a global conflict. Some of these were large and costly wars, while others were brief. The wisdom, legality, and morality of these interventions can, have been, and continue to be debated to this very day. Even if you grant every single one of the interventions in the premise, not one of them erases the fact that the Soviet Union, despite massive aid from the United States, collapsed from economic exhaustion caused by its own internal failures. They don't explain away the communist utopia of East Berlin needing a wall to keep its own people from emigrating. They don't explain the horrific events of Mao's Great Leap Forward or the Khmer Rouge emptying its cities. The argument in the clip relies entirely on selective history, using only American intervention to wipe the historical record clean of communist repression, mass graves, economic collapse, and human suffering. But you can't just erase history. When you put the intervention list next to the mountain of self-inflicted socialist failures, that premise, like the socialist superpower of the Soviet Union, collapses. And it does so, like the Soviet Union, because that premise is built on an unsustainable foundation, crushed by the weight of its own absurdity. Beyond the previous comparisons, history provides an even cleaner analytical test. In two major cases, we don't have to compare two different nations. We can look at a single nation before and after institutional reform, holding geography, culture, history, and language mostly constant, while the external pressure variable remained hostile or actually increased. We'll start with Communist China. Deng Xiaoping's market-oriented reforms began in 1978. The United States did not normalize diplomatic relations with Beijing until 1979 under Jimmy Carter. The decisive early moves, including but not limited to the household responsibility system in agriculture, the first openings to private enterprise, and the gradual relaxation of state price controls, all occurred under continued Cold War distance. As a result, growth accelerated almost immediately. In 1989, in the wake of the Tiananmen Square massacre, the United States and her Western allies imposed harsh economic sanctions on the country. Chinese economic expansion did not reverse. Even though external pressure rose, the institutional shift away from pure central planning continued, and as a result, the economy kept expanding. If American hostility were the primary variable dictating success or failure, that sequence should have been impossible. Vietnam provides an even clearer example of the exact same mechanism. Vietnam launched its economic renovation policy in 1986, while the full United States trade embargo was still in effect. That embargo remained in place for another 8 years, until 1994 under the Clinton administration. Price liberalization, the dismantling of the collective farm system, and the legalization of private business all occurred under continuous American isolation and sanctions. The Vietnamese economic turnaround began years before any meaningful relaxation of Western pressure. The institutional variable moved first, while the lifting of sanctions lagged by nearly a decade. These examples constitute before and after tests within the exact same borders. Everything else was held constant. Only the internal economic model changed, while the sanctions environment remained hostile or actively tightened. If external American pressure were the primary force preventing success, then economic reform executed under continued isolation should have failed to move the needle. It didn't. The needle moved only when they drifted away from a purely Marxist economic model. It's not just that central planning correlates with economic stagnation and collapse. Moving away from central planning correlates with immediate recovery and growth, even while external pressure is held constant or increased. That is a complete test of the mechanism. The internal institutional structure is the variable that matters, not the pressure applied against it. To fully understand why the Cold War hardened into a global struggle, we have to dispose of another favorite embedded in the intervention thesis, and that is the idea that Western powers force peaceful socialist states into defensive militarism. The historical record tells the exact opposite story. At every juncture following the Second World War, it was the communist bloc that chose aggressive escalation after the West had already offered cooperation. In 1947, the United States offered the Marshall Plan, which was a multi-billion-dollar economic aid package designed to rebuild economies that had been shattered by the war. That aid was offered to Eastern Europe as well. But Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, yes, the same Molotov who made the brilliant decision to enter into a non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler, walked out of the negotiations, and Stalin forced Poland and Czechoslovakia to reject Western assistance. Moscow chose to keep Eastern Europe impoverished and dependent rather than allow its satellite states to integrate with market economies. So once again, you have the economic engines of the free markets not hindering, mind you, but offering massive sums of capital to boost socialist states. It wasn't Western aggression that prompted the Berlin blockade and the decades-long Cold War. And in Asia, it was a communist-initiated war that shaped American strategy into one of containment. Before June 1950, Washington viewed continental Asia as a secondary geopolitical theater. U.S. troops had pulled out of South Korea, and official memorandums explicitly left the Korean peninsula outside the primary American defense perimeter. Our concerns were with the rebuilding of Japan and the Philippines. That posture changed on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces swept across the 38th parallel in a massive, unprovoked invasion. Declassified archives from Moscow confirm that Kim Il-sung, grandfather of the current North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, repeatedly traveled to Moscow to beg Stalin for approval to invade. Stalin initially hesitated, but in early 1950 he gave the green light, supplied heavy weapons, and coordinated with fellow communist dictator Mao in China. Stalin believed the West was too weak and divided to react. You see, Stalin thought that if the West did react, they would have to pull resources from Western Europe in order to do so, weakening the West enough for a breakthrough at the Fulda Gap in Germany so that Warsaw Pact forces could expand the socialist empire nearly unopposed. But socialist states are just peace-loving, non-aggressive people with no ambitions for world domination, I thought. The bloody invasion of South Korea shocked Washington into action. The unprovoked Korean War, a war where more than 36,000 Americans and many other United Nations forces died defending South Korea against communist aggression, proved that communist regimes were not interested in peaceful coexistence. The invasion directly triggered NSC 68, which increased defense spending and aimed to rebuild the military that had been scaled down at the conclusion of the Second World War, and cemented the domino theory that governed American foreign policy for the duration of the Cold War. The militarization of the Cold War was not born out of an American obsession with destroying socialism. It was forged in the crucible of North Korean tanks rolling into Seoul, Soviet blockades in Berlin, and Stalin's cynical geopolitical ambitions for Western Europe. We started this episode with a video clip making the claim that communism and socialism have never failed on their own merits, because America always interfered to destroy it. We put that claim to the test against the record of history. When the Soviet Union faced total starvation under Lenin's war communism, American intervention did not come in the form of bombs. Instead, it came in the form of the largest relief effort in history at the time, all thanks to the excesses of capitalism that kept over 10 million human beings alive day after day. When the Red Army was on the brink of collapse under Nazi invasion, American intervention came in the form of billions of dollars of trucks, boots, and fuel that enabled Soviet troops to drive all the way to Berlin. And how did that system repay capitalist generosity? With walls, machine gun nests, police states, forced labor camps, engineered famines, and eventual economic collapse. Where American pressure was non-existent, socialism produced the killing fields of Cambodia and the mass starvations of Maoist China. Where controlled comparisons existed, market economies produced high living standards and human flourishing, while socialist regimes built watchtowers to keep their citizens from fleeing. While external pressure can accelerate the failures of centralized planning, it doesn't invent the flaws that make failure probable. Apply pressure to a sturdy foundation, and the foundation is more likely to hold. Apply that same pressure to a structure that is already cracking under its own weight, and the collapse comes sooner. The pressure is real. The United States certainly took an aggressive economic and sometimes militaristic stance against socialist states. But American intervention was not the primary cause of the failure. The primary cause is the institutional design itself. The abolition of free markets, the nationalization of production, and the logic of treating entire social categories as permanent enemies, whether pressure is applied or not, appears to be the source. So, when modern political organizations, like the Democratic Socialists of America, claim that socialism can, in fact, create a workers' paradise, and the only reason it hasn't, because imperialist capitalist nations like the United States interfere to collapse the project before utopia can be achieved, well, that's just a flat-out lie. And history refuses to allow that lie to stand. In the next episode, we will step into the 1930s to examine the Great Terror under Stalin, the industrialization of the Cheka's early methods, now rebranded as the NKVD, the show trials, and the Gulag system. The mechanisms will be familiar. The scale will be unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Thank you for listening. The Command Post out.